There's a county in Kentucky where the genealogy records stop making sense around 1890, not because they were destroyed, not because they were lost, but because the family trees fold back into themselves so many times that modern geneticists had to invent new terminology just to describe what they were looking at. The Fugate family wasn't just isolated. They were mathematically entangled in a way that turned their bloodline into something closer to a loop than a line. And when researchers finally convinced members to submit DNA samples in 2004, the lab called back with a question no one had prepared for. Are we testing one family, or are we testing the same person multiple times? This isn't folklore. This isn't Appalachian legend embellished by outsiders who never walked those hills. This is documented, recorded, mapped across 7 generations of birth certificates, census data, and medical records that hospitals kept but rarely discussed. The Fugates lived in Troublesome Creek, a name that now feels like a prophecy no one took seriously enough. They were known for one thing before anything else: their skin. A deep, unsettling blue that didn't fade in sunlight, didn't wash away, and didn't respond to any treatment doctors could offer in the 19th century. But the blue skin wasn't the mystery, it was the symptom. The real question was buried deeper in the choices made by people who had other options but took none of them. By the time scientists identified methemoglobinemia as the cause, the damage was generational. The genetic mutation required for that condition to express so vividly, so consistently, demanded something most families would find unthinkable. It demanded repetition. It demanded that the same recessive genes meet again and again across decades, passed down not through bad luck, but through decisions made in full daylight by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And the Fugates weren't victims of geography. They were architects of their own genetic collapse. This is the story of a family that didn't just intermarry. They interwove so completely that separating one member's DNA from another became a puzzle even modern science struggled to solve. And it started with a single man who arrived in Kentucky in 1820 with nothing but a French surname and a gene that should have disappeared in 2 generations. Martin Fugate came to Troublesome Creek from France with skin the color of a bruised plum. In an era when difference meant suspicion, when appearance could dictate survival, he didn't hide. He settled into the hills of Perry County, Kentucky, and married Elizabeth Smith, a woman described in land records as pale as limestone. Their union should have diluted whatever Martin carried in his blood. That's how genetics is supposed to work. Dominant traits overpower recessive ones, anomalies fade, but 4 of their 7 children were born blue. Not jaundiced, not ill, blue, a shade that neighbors would later describe as ranging from slate to indigo, depending on the cold, the altitude, the stress their bodies endured. The medical community in the 1820s had no framework for this. Doctors who examined the Fugate children found strong pulses, clear lungs, and an unsettling vitality that contradicted everything their skin suggested. These weren't sickly children. They worked the fields. They grew into adulthood. They married. And this is where the choices began to narrow in ways that turned genetic probability into genetic certainty. Because the Fugates didn't marry outward. They married adjacent. Cousins to cousins, nieces to uncles by marriage who were already relatives through blood. The community was small, isolated by ridges and rivers that made travel difficult and outsiders rare. But isolation doesn't force your hand. It just makes the other option easier to avoid. By 1850, the family tree had begun to resemble something closer to a web. Zachariah Fugate married his mother's sister's daughter. Their children married back into lines that Zachariah himself descended from. Each generation tightened the knot. The blue skin became more common, not less. It appeared in babies born to parents who both carried the recessive gene for methemoglobinemia, a condition where hemoglobin can't release oxygen properly, leaving blood a dark oxygen, starved color visible through the skin. For this to happen once is rare. For it to happen across 70 years in the same family, in the same valley, requires repetition that goes beyond coincidence. The Fugates knew they had to. When your cousin's child is born blue, and then your own child is born blue, and then your neighbor, who is also your second cousin, has a blue child, the pattern isn't hidden. It's generational. It's in the room with you every time another baby takes its first breath and the midwife goes silent. But the marriages continued, the births continued, and by the time the Civil War tore through Kentucky, the Fugate bloodline had become so recursive that tracking lineage required accounting for individuals who appeared in their own family tree 6 or 7 different ways. But there's a photograph from 1912 preserved in the archives of the University of Kentucky Medical Library that shows a Fugate family gathering, 17 people arranged on the porch of a timber house, and if you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd think the film had degraded. But the discoloration isn't chemical, it's biological. 6 of the people in that photograph have skin the color of a winter sky before snow. They're not ghosts. They're not edited. They're standing in full daylight, and their faces carry the weight of people who have stopped explaining themselves. Because, by 1912, the Fugates had lived with this for nearly a century. They'd learned that doctors couldn't help, that curiosity from outsiders turned quickly into revulsion, that the only people who didn't recoil were the ones who shared their blood. So they stayed close. Troublesome Creek became a kingdom of 30 square miles where everyone was related in at least 3 directions. Church records from the area show baptisms, marriages, and burials all listing the same 5 surnames, rotating like a card deck shuffled too many times. Fugate, Combs, Smith, Ritchie, Stacy, and underneath those surnames, the given names repeated too, multiple Zacharias, multiple Elizabeths. As if the family was naming children after ancestors they were also descended from in ways the Bible never intended. When census workers came through in 1880 and again in 1900, they noted discrepancies they couldn't resolve. Households where the age gaps between supposed siblings stretched across 20 years. Families where the mother and daughter shared a husband's last name before either married him. The medical consequences compounded. Beyond the blue skin, there were immune deficiencies. Stillbirths at rates 3 times the county average. Children who survived infancy but didn't survive adolescence. Their bodies unable to fight infections that should have been routine. The genetic load, the accumulation of recessive mutations passed down through shared ancestry, was crushing them, but it wasn't invisible, it wasn't silent. The Fugates buried their children in a cemetery on a hillside above Troublesome Creek, and the graves are small. Row after row of stones marking lives that lasted months, not years. The oldest graves date back to the 1830s. The most recent is from 1979, and still the intermarriage continued, not because they didn't understand, but because leaving meant confronting a world that had already decided what they were. The few Fugates who moved to towns outside Perry County came back within a generation. They'd tried, they'd married outside the bloodline. But their children came back, and when they came back, they married in, because Troublesome Creek was the only place where blue skin didn't make you a monster. It just made you family, and family, no matter how tangled, was the only thing that didn't turn away. In 1960, a hematologist named Madison Cowan arrived in Hazard, Kentucky, chasing a rumor he didn't quite believe. He'd heard about a family with blue skin living in the hills, and like most trained physicians, he assumed it was exaggeration. Folklore thickened by repetition, but then he met them. A woman named Luna Fugate Stacy walked into a clinic with her husband, both in their 60s, both the color of a lake before a storm. Kaween didn't speak for nearly a minute. He examined their hands, their fingernails, their lips. He ran blood tests that came back with methemoglobin levels 7 times higher than normal. These people should have been dead, or at minimum bedridden. But they were farming, raising grandchildren, living full lives with blood that couldn't carry oxygen the way human blood was designed to. Kaween began mapping the family. He drove dirt roads into the mountains, interviewing relatives who'd heard of him and relatives who hadn't. And what he found wasn't just a medical curiosity, it was a genetic monument to isolation. He identified over 200 individuals across 6 generations, all descended from Martin Fugate, all interconnected through marriages that blurred the line between family reunion and wedding ceremony. Some branches of the tree had tried to grow outward. A few Fugates married into families from Virginia or Tennessee, introducing new genetic material. But those lines either moved away or were reabsorbed within 2 generations, their children marrying back into Troublesome Creek, back into the same surnames, the same bloodlines, the same tightening circle. Kaween found the mutation, a recessive gene that altered enzyme production, preventing the conversion of methemoglobin back into functional hemoglobin. For a child to be born blue, both parents had to carry the gene. The odds of that happening randomly are microscopic. But when your parents are second cousins, and their parents were also related, and the pool of potential partners numbers in the dozens rather than the thousands, those odds collapse into inevitability. Kaween treated some of the family with methylene blue injections, a simple compound that restored normal hemoglobin function within minutes. He watched as Luna's skin faded from blue to pink in less than an hour. She looked at her hands like they belonged to someone else. Then she asked him not to come back, because the blue skin, as horrifying as it seemed to outsiders, had become identity. It marked you as Fugate. It meant you belonged, and for people who had spent generations being ostracized, studied, whispered about in towns they'd never even visited, that belonging mattered more than normalcy. Kaween published his findings in a medical journal in 1964. The article was clinical, detached, focused entirely on the blood disorder. He never mentioned the marriages. He never explained how the genetic isolation happened. He just documented that it did. And when reporters began calling, asking for interviews, asking to meet the family, Luna Fugate Stacy told them all the same thing: we ain't on display. By the 1980s, the Fugates had learned to disappear in plain sight. The blue skin faded from the youngest generation, not because the bloodline opened up, but because enough carriers had married non-carriers that the visible expression of methemoglobinemia finally diluted below the threshold of manifestation. But the gene didn't disappear, it just went quiet, waiting. The family still lives in eastern Kentucky. They still carry the same surnames. And when genetic testing became commercially available in the early 2000s, some of them submitted samples to ancestry companies, curious about heritage, about connections to distant relatives, about the usual reasons people spit into tubes and mail them off. The results came back flagged, not incorrect, flagged. The algorithms designed to detect familial relationships couldn't pass what they were seeing. Individuals showed up as simultaneously second cousins, third cousins, and fourth cousins to the same person. The genetic similarity between family members was so high that the software kept triggering alerts meant to catch cases of unknown parentage or recent incest. Customer service representatives called to ask if there had been a mistake in labeling, if multiple people had used the same kit, because the DNA didn't look like a family tree. It looked like a genetic echo chamber where the same markers repeated across every branch, folded over themselves so many times that distinguishing one line from another required manual analysis by specialists who'd never seen anything like it outside of laboratory studies on isolated populations. One genealogist, hired by a Fugate descendant trying to build a family tree for a school project, quit after 3 weeks. She returned the money and sent a single-page letter explaining that the documentation didn't reconcile, that she'd found individuals listed as their own ancestors through multiple pathways, that the marriages in the 1800s created genealogical loops she couldn't untangle without either assuming errors in the records or accepting that the family had intermarried so thoroughly that standard lineage software couldn't model it. She recommended they contact a university, someone who studied population genetics, someone who wouldn't be disturbed by what the data revealed. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have left? Would you have stayed? Or would you have done what the Fugates did and made peace with the fact that sometimes survival means sacrificing the future for the comfort of the familiar? Because that's what this was, not ignorance, not cruelty, but a choice made generation after generation to stay inside the boundaries of what was known, even when those boundaries were slowly crushing them. The Fugates weren't monsters. They were people trapped by geography, by poverty, by a world that had already decided they were too strange to integrate, and so they built their own world, a world where everyone was blood, where everyone understood, where the cost of that understanding was written into every birth, every marriage, every child born blue and gasping in a cabin on Troublesome Creek. There's a silence that follows this kind of history. Not the silence of forgetting, but the silence of people who know they've inherited something they can't undo. The Fugates who remain don't talk to journalists anymore. They don't participate in documentaries. When researchers from Johns Hopkins reached out in 2011 to request interviews for a study on genetic founder effects in isolated populations, every single family member declined. One response, typed on a single sheet of paper and mailed back with no return address, said only, "We've been studied enough." And that was the end of it. The scientists moved on. The family stayed where it had always been. But the genetic consequences didn't stop with blue skin. Modern medical privacy laws prevent the publication of detailed health records, but doctors who have worked in Perry County speak carefully about patterns they've seen. Higher than average rates of autosomal recessive disorders, cystic fibrosis, markers in families with no known European ancestry beyond the Fugates, bleeding disorders that trace back to the same narrow genetic bottleneck Martin Fugate created when he married Elizabeth Smith in 1820. The blue skin was dramatic, visible, but it was just one expression of a much deeper genetic fragility that still runs through the bloodline today. Children are still being born with complications that geneticists can trace directly to the family's history of intermarriage, though the families themselves rarely make the connection. Or if they do, they don't say it out loud. The land itself holds the evidence. Troublesome Creek still winds through Perry County, and the houses along its banks still carry the same names on their mailboxes: Fugate, Combs, Ritchie. The cemetery on the hillside has been expanded twice, but the old section remains untouched, a grid of small stones weathered smooth by 140 years of rain. Local historians estimate that nearly 600 people are buried there, spanning 7 generations. More than half of those graves belong to children under the age of 10. The mortality rate in that cemetery is 4 times higher than any other burial ground in the county. And when you walk through it, when you read the names and see how they repeat, see how the same given names appear on stones separated by decades, you start to understand that this wasn't just a family. It was a closed system, a biological experiment conducted without oversight, without intervention, and without escape. Modern genetics has a term for what happened to the Fugates. It's called a genetic drift in an isolated founder population. It sounds clinical, sterile, but what it means is that when a small group of people reproduces only within itself for long enough, the gene pool becomes a genetic minefield. Beneficial mutations don't spread. Harmful ones don't disappear. Everything just accumulates, generation after generation, until the load becomes unsustainable. The Fugates survived longer than most populations in similar circumstances. But survival isn't the same as thriving, and the cost of that survival is still being paid by people who were born a century after the choices were made. No one forced this. No law required it. The Fugates chose isolation over integration, familiarity over risk, and the comfort of blood over the uncertainty of strangers. And in doing so, they created a lineage so intertwined that even now, 2 decades into the 21st century, their DNA tells a story most families would bury. There's a house still standing on Troublesome Creek. It's not the original Fugate homestead that collapsed in the 1950s, but it's close enough to the site that you can see the foundation stones through the overgrowth. A family lives there now. They didn't want their names used, but they agreed to speak on the condition that nothing identifying would be published. They're descended from the Fugates, 5 generations removed from the last visibly blue member of the family. They know the history, they've seen the photographs, and when asked if they'd ever taken a DNA test, the answer was immediate: no, and we won't. Because knowing changes things. Knowing means confronting the exact percentage of shared genetics between your grandparents. Knowing means seeing in precise numbers what your family tree looks like when it's untangled by algorithms that don't understand loyalty or isolation, or the kinds of choices people make when the rest of the world has already written them off. The Fugates who remain have decided that some things are better left unquantified. They live with the legacy, they carry the genes, but they don't need a laboratory to tell them what their blood already knows. In 2019, a graduate student from the University of Kentucky attempted to create a comprehensive genealogical map of the Fugate family using public records, census data, and digitized church archives. The project was abandoned after 18 months, not because the data was missing, but because the connections were too dense to visualize in any format that made sense. The family tree, when rendered, looked like a neural network. Lines crossing and recrossing, names appearing in multiple locations simultaneously. The student's advisor described it as genealogically recursive, a term that doesn't exist in standard academic literature because most families don't require it. The thesis was never published, the map was never completed, and the Fugates were never contacted about the findings. The last known visibly blue Fugate was Benjamin Stacy, born in 1975. His skin was the color of a bruise at birth, shocking the hospital staff in Lexington who'd never seen methemoglobinemia in person. His grandmother was Luna Fugate Stacy, the same woman Madison Cowan had treated 15 years earlier. Benjamin's color faded as he grew, his body adapting, his methemoglobin levels stabilizing as his enzyme production normalized. By the time he was 7, you couldn't tell. He looked like any other child in eastern Kentucky. But the gene is still there, recessive, waiting, And if Benjamin's children marry someone who also carries it, someone descended from the same bloodline through a different branch, the blue skin could return. Not as tragedy, not as disease, but as inheritance. This is what remains, not a cautionary tale, because the Fugates aren't a warning, they're a record, a documentation of what happens when a family decides that the known, no matter how damaged, is safer than the unknown. They survived, they endured, but survival cost them their genetic future, and that cost is still being calculated in hospital rooms and family trees across eastern Kentucky. The clan was so interlinked that even DNA tests struggle to separate them. And maybe that's exactly what they wanted, to be inseparable, to be bound so tightly that nothing, not science, not time, not even death, could ever pull them apart. The creek still runs, the graves still stand, and somewhere in those hills, the Fugates are still there, carrying a history written not in books, but in blood.